folks. It is officially noon. Welcome, everyone. Good to see your names or faces. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Caitlin Costello, who's an associate clinical professor right here in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. She's the training director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellowship Program and the medical director of Child and Adolescent Outpatient Services at Langley Porter Psychiatric Hospital and Clinics. She completed medical school and general psychiatry residency at Johns Hopkins University, fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry at Columbia and Cornell Universities, and fellowship in forensic psychiatry at UCSF. Her interests include medical education, curriculum development, obsessive compulsive and tic disorders, the interface between psychiatry and the legal system and juvenile justice. Please join me in a warm welcome. Thank you so much, Dr. Costello, for joining our series this year. Dr. Costello is also part of the CAP-GR committee, so we're really lucky to have a resident expert on youth and perspectives on social media and online risk-taking. So I will mute myself and you can take it away, Dr. Costello.
Thanks, Barbara. So as you mentioned, I'm going to be talking about protecting youth online, and in particular, clinical and legal perspectives on social media and online risk-taking. I have no disclosures. I always think that the day someone pays me for something that I need to disclose will be the day I know I've made it, but that day is not today. Today, we're going to be talking about both clinical and legal risks associated with social media use in youth, the legal background and status of minors interacting online, and we'll talk about developing a plan to assess and advise patients and families around these risks. So no surprise to anyone, teens and tweens are very online and then they use social media. And social media use has increased since the start of the pandemic. Entertainment screen use for both teens and tweens went up more between 19 to 21 than it did between 2015 to 2019. So in less than half the time had a significantly more increase. Looking at what they're doing online. So the top sites for both teens and tweens are Instagram and Snapchat. If you're like me and you have a Facebook account that you don't use and no other social media, you might have thought, had you listened to any of your teen patients or any of the CAP fellows, that you are interacting with social media in the least cool possible way. It turns out it's only the third least cool possible. So I felt great there. 38% of tweens have used social media at all. The large majority of teens have. 18% of tweens use social media every day, and the majority of teens use social media every day. Looking at the difference between frequency of use and amount of enjoyment is kind of interesting. The rates for both tweens and teens of who uses social media daily are higher than the ones who enjoy it a lot. So maybe a lot doesn't mean daily to them, or maybe it's an indication that people are using social media even more than they actually enjoy its use. Important to note that access is not equitable to technology in general. And so we can see that although entertainment screen use is higher among Black and Latinx populations and lower family income teens and tweens, access to home computers is lower in the same populations. And so if you're accessing the internet only through a smartphone and you don't have a computer, social media is a lot more accessible than, say, online education and homework. So the discrepancies are important to keep in mind there. So what are they doing? Again, Snapchat, Instagram are the big ones, both for tweens and teens with a little bit of difference in between. What they're not doing more of since the pandemic is reading books. And we're looking at minorities of both of those populations who are reading for pleasure. I'm going to be talking a lot about the risks of social media use among youth, And I don't want the presentation to be overly fear-mongering. So I will mention that there are a number of benefits for young people using social media. Those include decreased isolation and socialization, forming communities, and this is particularly important for teens and tweens in various minority groups that may not have access to communities in person the same way. Education, access to information, independence, and even access to crisis services. So that said, back to the fear-mongering. We're going to talk about our risks based on a really common presentation. So imagine that during your clinical evaluation of a 14-year-old girl, you're asking your usual screening questions about social media use, which I hope we're all asking. And she mentioned that she has been exchanging photographs with a boy she met online. What other information do you want about this scenario? And feel free to shout out or throw answers in the chat.
What kind of pictures?
What is in those pictures?
Are they feet?
How old is the boy? Is the boy a boy? Is this only an online boy, or do they know each other in real life? What social media platform? Who knows about this? Who started it? Yes, all of those details matter. What potential risks does this patient face? Exploitation. The boy distributing the photos to others. Bullying. Abuse, sex trafficking, being pressured. Potential legal risks to her. Parental reaction, can't take it back once you've shared it. Love these answers. So we're going to talk about all of this. Okay, among the risks of social media use in youth, depression, anxiety, decreased well-being, so negative mental health effects, social comparison, exposure to negative mental health content with potential social contagion, cyberbullying, sexting, exposure to substance use. These are just some of them. So the question of, is social media bad for mental health overall, turns out to be complicated, and studies looking at this have had mixed results. Looking at a couple of recent large analyses, so an analysis across 3 large data sets showed an association between digital technology use and negative well-being, but it was really small. Another recent meta-analysis found a mix of associations, mostly small, and it was really hard to distinguish cause and effect between social media use and mental health symptoms. This is a complicated question. Social media use is a big bucket. So it's not as simple as it being good or bad for mental health, and may depend on the specifics. So examples of what those specifics might be are potential windows of vulnerability. So a large longitudinal analysis found that higher use of social media predicted decreased life satisfaction later at specific developmental windows for girls ages 11 to 13, and then again at age 19, for boys ages 14 to 15, and then again at age 19. The pattern of engagement might matter. So another study found that in girls, social media use starting early in adolescence and increasing over time predicted suicidality in young adulthood. And that was not there for boys. So that specific pattern of use. And then what they're doing on social media, of course, may matter as well. So a recent meta-analysis just of studies done during the pandemic, looking at potential pandemic effects, found that most of them showed an association between social media use and negative well-being or ill-being, although they were mostly small. However, some types of social media engagement were helpful to well-being. Those included one-to-one communication, self-disclosure in a mutual online friendship, and positive and funny experiences online. On the other hand, some types of engagement showed negative associations with well-being, and those included social comparison, fear of missing out, and exposure to negative contents. So we're going to talk about some of those that are associated with risks of negative well-being. So social comparison. So this is when you're looking at posts online and they are showing a highly curated version of other people's lives, where other people's lives look really great and your life might not look so great in comparison. Even the social media companies know that this is a problem. So in September of last year, the Wall Street Journal published internal Facebook reports showing what they knew at Facebook about the effects of Instagram on teens, and in particular teen girls. So this is an internal slideshow from Facebook that was obtained and published. These are quotes from people at Instagram. We make body image worse for 1 in 3 teen girls. Teens blame Instagram for increases in the rate of anxiety and depression. This reaction was unprompted and consistent across all groups. These internal researchers also concluded that partly the issues were specific to Instagram as opposed to other social media platforms, with Instagram being really more focused on images themselves, as opposed to TikTok, which has also a performance focus, as opposed to Snapchat, which has kind of lots of use of filters and goofier images. And so this is thought to enhance the social comparison problem specifically with Instagram. Okay, so Instagram, at least, decided to put a pause on Instagram Kids, which was going to be the rollout of Instagram for kids younger than age 13. Adam Mosseri said they are starting to recognize that kids are misrepresenting their age and downloading apps that are meant for those 13 and older, putting the blame on the young children and not on the fact that federal law requires Instagram to get parental permission for kids under 13 to use it. Oh, but then he says it will require parental permission to join. It won't have ads, have age-appropriate content and features. Doesn't mention that federal law requires parental permission to join. We'll get to that in a minute. So that was September 2021. Their Instagram is recognizing problems in some way. They're doing something, right? Well, here's October 2021. And now Instagram is found to promote pages glorifying eating disorders to teen accounts. And so this was tested by a number of folks who made profiles as if they were a young teen girl and found that Instagram was specifically pushing pro-eating disorder content. Speaking of exposure to negative content, just another example is here's a recent study looking at Instagram posts with hashtags, with several common hashtags related to self-harm. And in the year 2018, over the course of the year, they increased from 70,000 to 110,000. Pretty big increase in 1 year. Now, of course, that was 2018. But Instagram in 2019 disallowed the use of graphic images of self-harm. And then later that year, they made it even stricter by no longer allowing fictional depictions of self-harm. So there shouldn't be any problem, right? So let's see how this goes. So I did an Instagram search for self-harm. And just look at the first 2 profiles that Instagram suggested to me. Yeah, it's not a graphic depiction of self-harm and it's not great. Okay, here's the second one. Now this starts off a little better. At least they're saying, please don't cut. But then these are the photos that this profile posted. Now remember, I don't know how to use Instagram. Like, I'm not even sure what the hashtag does exactly. Do you put it in the search bar? It's all very confusing to me. I found this in 2 seconds. So what is a teen who's more savvy than me, who's specifically looking for this kind of content, going to find? To be fair to Instagram, it's not just them, TikTok is in on it too. So TikTok bans self-harm images and hashtags, and there are ways around it. Teens are going to find ways around bans. Speaking of TikTok, many of us probably heard about the TikTok tics phenomenon, where teen girls in particular were presenting to mental health and neurology settings with tic disorders after seeing TikTok videos about people with tic disorders. And the tic disorders they were presenting with were quite atypical in terms of age of onset, the nature of the tics, the degree of severity, et cetera, suggesting a social contagion effect there. All right, moving on to the next risk, cyberbullying. So defined as bullying that occurs online or through technology. Bullying is defined as any unwanted aggressive behavior by another youth or group of youths that involves an observed or perceived power imbalance and is repeated multiple times or is likely to be repeated. It can occur in a variety of ways online, not just social media, but definitely including social media. The 2018 Pew Research Center survey, the most recent one, showed that a majority of teens have experienced cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is associated with a number of negative mental health effects: depression, anxiety, behavioral issues, eating disorders, irritability, self-pity, and in school performance, truancy, somatic issues in both the victim and the bullies. Elevated risk of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and suicide deaths, again, in both the victims and the bullies. There have been multiple highly publicized suicides that have been attributed to cyberbullying. Suicidality risk is increased when bullying is both online and in person, when there is sexting involved, and when the cyberbullying is rated as severe or interferes with school learning. Youth at higher risk of being the victims of cyberbullying include students with learning differences and disabilities, LGBTQ youth, Black or Latinx youth, and female. Factors that increase the risk for psychopathology among the bullied are feelings of not belonging or social isolation, perceived burdensomeness, presence of pre-existing psychopathology, ACEs, and increased severity of cyberbullying. Next risk, sexting. So now we're getting closer to the experience of the girl in our case scenario, who could also be experiencing cyberbullying in this online relationship, we don't know. Sexting is defined as sending or forwarding sexually explicit photographs of the sender or someone known to the sender. It tends to be transmission of material that would qualify as child sexual abuse material unless designated by state law. A 2018 JAMA Pediatrics meta-analysis found that of juvenile participants, and this was throughout adolescence, 24.7 had received a sext and 14.8 had sent a sext, although studies vary and some show rates of up to 60% prevalence of sexting among teenagers. Clinical risks of sexting include fear, stress, and shame for both the sender and the receiver. Girls are disproportionately affected by this. Increased risk of suicide attempts and suicidal ideation, anxiety and depression, delinquent behavior, alcohol, smoking. Sexting associated with an earlier age of onset of sexual activity, multiple sexual partners, and a decreased likelihood of using contraception. So lots of clinical risks, many of them potentially faced by the patient in our scenario, both based on what we know and based on what teens are commonly doing online outside of the very specific interaction that we're hearing about. Teens also face a number of legal risks of social media activity. Cyberbullying and sexting have legal risks to the teen. Exposure to online solicitation and predation, cyberstalking and cyber harassment, and our teen patients could be victims or perpetrators of any of these. Then there's a big category of risks that I would call reputation damage. And so this is essentially a poorly thought out post that's viewed by an unintended audience or is interpreted by the audience in a way that the poster didn't mean for it to be interpreted. Unintended audiences can and do include college admissions officers and potential employers. Sometimes the consequences of these poorly thought out posts can include criminal consequences. So sexting, in addition to the clinical risks, has a number of legal risks. So sending sexually explicit images of minors, depending on the laws in your jurisdiction, opens the sender and receiver to potential charges for distributing and accessing child sexual abuse material. These are commonly encountered. This was a study of state prosecutors almost 10 years ago, and the rates are higher now, showing that this was common. It's not very common for teens who are sexting to be prosecuted, particularly if it's just sending images of themselves rather than redistributing images of someone else without consent. But it has happened. Charges are more likely to be brought in case of extenuating circumstances like malicious intent, bullying, non-consensual forwarding, redistributing large age differences, young children, especially explicit graphic or violent images, or adults sending nude photos to minors. Again, unless the state has a sexting law excluding this, transmission of obscene matter depicting children is illegal. It's not common, as mentioned, for a teen to be prosecuted just for sending images of themselves, but it has happened. There was a case in 2017, just as an example, of a 17-year-old who sexted to an adult woman, was convicted of one count of second-degree dealing in depictions of a minor engaged in sexually explicit activity. Possession of sexually explicit photographs of himself was considered to be possession of child pornography. All right, back to our case. So let's say we have established that the photographs are indeed sexually explicit. What are you going to do with this information? Are you going to tell anyone, and who? Feel free to shout out or chat. So Barbara says parents and CPS. Question about how old is the boy, does it matter? Would we need more information to determine whether her confidentiality takes precedence? All good questions. Well, California doesn't have a sexting exception. So she's sending sexually explicit photographs. That is illegal. Now we don't have to report everything that's illegal, right? Also, what if she only received sexually explicit images and didn't send them? Does that change your calculus? Do we know if there's a safety issue here? How do we screen for that? Do we screen for that? Does it matter? Oh, these are good questions. Well, some of the answers lie in California Assembly Bill 1775. This went into effect in 2015. What this new law did was it added to the Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, or CANRA. CANRA is what makes us mandated reporters. It's in the California Penal Code, which means it's a crime to not make a mandated report, and lays out, who are mandated reporters, what and how we need to report. So Assembly Bill 1775 added to the definition of sexual exploitation, which is one of the things we have to report, a person who knowingly downloads, streams, or accesses through any electronic or digital media, a film, photograph, videotape, video recording, negative, or slide in which a child is engaged in an act of obscene sexual conduct. Oh, so wait a minute. This means if our patient of any age tells us that they have accessed child pornography, now better known as child sexual abuse material, that is reportable. That's a mandated report. And our patient at least accessed and distributed sexually explicit material of a minor. So there we go. This law was controversial for a number of reasons. One, for someone who had accessed child pornography and did not want to have a contact offense and was trying to get help so that they didn't. It makes it very hard for them to get mental health help because the mental health professional is a mandated reporter. It's very controversial if the idea is that we have to report a teen patient for sexting. Although if they were distributing, the downloading and streaming and accessing clause didn't have to be there for that. None of us want to report our 14-year-old patient for sexting with her boyfriend. So you can see why this law has had quite a bit of controversy around it. Okay, other legal risks of social media activity. So here we get into the broad sort of reputation damage category. Just an example, so this, didn't have incredibly serious consequences, but this is the first thing you'll find if you Google this teen's name, which is probably not what the teen was intending their first association on the internet forevermore to be. Was a 17-year-old who tweeted that the school principal should probably be shoveling the snow to clear the parking lots out. The kind of thing that before social media we may have muttered under our breath to a classmate. Now it's out there, cause for suspension and first association with this person online for who knows how long. This was a recent case, many probably remember, where a bunch of teens were arrested for threats of violence at schools last December. Unclear how serious some of these threats were. This article quoted a teen who suggested that they were not particularly serious threats. And maybe they were. This one, though, so this was a 14-year-old girl from the Netherlands who, for unclear reasons, tweeted at American Airlines that she was part of Al Qaeda and was going to do something really big. American Airlines took it very seriously. She furiously started tweeting that she was just kidding, and she was arrested. Okay, back to our case. So we know the photographs are sexually explicit. What, if any, legal protections does this patient have? They're a minor, potentially protective. In charge of her own privilege over age 12. So interestingly enough, or really uninterestingly, depending on your perspective, the foundation of what protections there are or aren't is largely founded in contract law. The reason for that is when you agree to the terms of service on a website, and the photo on the left there is the terms of service for several popular websites, you are entering a contract with the website. Raise your Zoom hand if you always read the terms of service. Click scrolling down. Raise your Zoom hand if you have ever read a complete terms of service. And finally, raise your Zoom hand if you think your teenage patients are reading the terms of service before they enter a contract with the website. So no, they are not. Now, why is this a contract? Well, courts have generally agreed that what they call click wrap and browse wrap agreements create valid contracts binding the user to the terms of service. Click wrap is when you click yes or I agree on the terms of service. Browse wrap means you don't have to necessarily actively agree to anything. Just if you continue to browse the website and the terms of service are accessible to you somewhere, it's assumed that you agree to them. Now, why is wrap in there at all? Well, way in the olden days, before you were born, if you were a trainee, software used to come on discs that you had to insert into the computer, and they were packaged in boxes that were shrink wrapped. And when you broke open the shrink wrap, that was considered to be you then agreeing to the terms of service. When this comes up in courts, the question is generally whether the consumer had reasonable notice of and manifested consent to the online agreement. And manifesting consent can be as simple as continuing to browse when the terms of service are there if you want to see them. So here's just an example, Schwartz v. Comcast, of a case where the court held that any reasonable adult would have understood the basic terms of the contract. The obvious question that comes up there is, well, what about non-adults? Did they become legally bound by click wrap and browse wrap contracts? And the answer is, in part, it depends on the age. So there is a federal law, COPPA, Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, requiring parental consent for the collection and use of children's personal information online by websites. It applies only to children under age 13. It was developed out of concern that companies were directing online marketing to children and collecting personal information without parental consent or notification. It was criticized at the time for cumbersome age verification requirements, parental consent verification requirements, inadequate protection, and inadequate enforcement. And it requires things like parents to fax their signature to the website to give legal permission, which they weren't doing in the year 2000. They're definitely not doing it now unless they happen to work at an academic medical center. And it was just really easy to get around any of these restrictions. Also, it applies only to children under age 13. This is why many popular social media sites have 13 as their age minimums. Most of them don't do much to verify it. The user just has to enter a birth date that makes them at least age 13. Why age 13? Well, they did get input from the American Psychological Association, which stressed that children under 13 lack the developmental capacity to understand the request for information and the implications for privacy. So should adolescents over age 13 be assumed that they do understand the potential consequences of sharing their personal information online? That's not so clear. And remember, this law was developed in the late 90s and enacted in the year 2000. The risks were different. Online was different. We weren't talking about social media, sexting, the risk that your posts could be widely redistributed. This was the age of you got an AOL CD in the mail and used your dial-up to dial in. The law was developed out of concern for marketing to young people, not social media related risks. And there's a whole variety of risks with interacting online now that did not exist.
You've got mail.
At the time of the development of this law. But because that's the only federal law offering protection, and it only offers protection to kids under age 13, 13 to 17-year-olds can legally contract or consent to terms of service just like adults. These contracts have been upheld in court. They've been upheld in court even if the minor was online saying they were an adult. In contrast, in almost every other legal context, we recognize that juveniles ages 13 to 17 are not adults and they are developmentally immature compared to adults. Look at the trend, which was, unfortunately reversed a little bit in the most recent Supreme Court ruling on this topic, but in sentencing of juvenile offenders, the trend has been increasingly to recognize the immaturity of teens that decreases their criminal culpability. Justice Kagan, in the majority opinion for Miller v. Alabama, which got rid of mandatory statutes calling for life without parole for juveniles, saying that it should be reserved for the worst of the worst offenders, and that a state can't just automatically send all juveniles convicted of murder to life without parole. He noted that adolescents versus adults are immature, have less sense of responsibility, are prone to recklessness, impulsivity, and risk-taking, vulnerable to peer pressure, and less able to assess the consequences of their actions. In non-criminal contexts, we recognize that teens are different from adults. Minors can acquire property, but generally considered incapable of managing it, can't legally vote, serve on juries, marry without parental consent, purchase alcohol and tobacco, or own firearms. And a minor's contract is voided if the minor chooses to void it, unless it's an online contract. So does this make any sense at all in terms of what we know about juveniles and how they make decisions about interacting online and whether they are really able to knowingly consent to these contracts? Well, we have to look a little bit at adolescent decision-making. And when we do that, we notice that skills for different aspects of decision-making reach maturity at different rates. So many skills related to other legal decision-making contexts mature around mid-adolescence. So comprehension of Miranda rights matures around age 15. Competency to stand trial matures around age 16. And I would note that the evaluations for these skills are based on understanding and not on the actual decisions that those juveniles then go on to make in legal contexts. So they're cognitive tests. And this matches up with other tests of sort of pure cognition, kind of reaching maturity around age 16, around mid-adolescence. However, decision-making skills that involve psychosocial maturity as opposed to cognitive maturity develop later. So a nice illustration of this difference was in a study by Steinberg and company, who looked at young people ages 10 to 30 and it tested them in two areas. One was pure cognitive skills, working memory, digispan, verbal fluency. They found that those skills increased with age, but then leveled off at age 16. And again, this is what we find in lots of tests of sort of pure cognitive capacity. Then they also looked at psychosocial maturity. So these were tests of risk perception, sensation seeking, impulsivity, ability to resist the influence of their peers, and orientation towards the future as opposed to towards the present. These didn't start showing differences until age 16. And the 26 and up did better than the 18 to 21-year-olds. So the 15-year-olds didn't do any better than the 10-year-olds in these skills. And then they continued to develop into the 20s. You'll notice on the graph, there actually appears to be a little dip at age 14 to 15. That was non-significant in this study, but other studies have shown that that is around where peak impulsivity tends to occur. So they actually may be worse in mid-adolescence than they were as younger children. Just to really hammer this point home, here's the difference, and it's stark. Cognitive skills increase with age, then level off at 16. Psychosocial skills don't even start maturing until age 16 and continue to mature through the 20s. The authors also note that context of this decision-making matters, and adolescents are likely to make more mature decisions in contexts that permit deliberative and reasoned decision-making with minimized emotional and social influences and with consultation with adults available. On the contrary, adolescents are likely to make immature decisions in situations eliciting impulsivity with high levels of emotional arousal or social coercion, or not encouraging expert consultation with adults. This all, of course, maps on very well to what we know about the developing brain and the areas that continue to develop into the 20s. So let's look at how what we learn about cognitive versus psychosocial maturity and adolescent decision-making, how this applies to online participation. So when an adolescent enters a click wrap or browse wrap agreement, after definitely not having read the terms of service, and starts posting online, this is likely to occur without logical reflection, without adult consultation, and without considering the risks of participation. Circumstances of decision of what to post online are likely to elicit immature decision-making skills. Posting online is often quite emotionally salient, with a lot of social influence from peers, which are also circumstances that we know elicit immature decision-making skills in adolescents. Okay, one more time returning to our case. How can we help reduce our patient's risks or mitigate damage that may have already occurred? How can we help her? Work with the family, educate her about the risks, educate her about the law. Does she know that this is considered distribution of child pornography? Motivational interviewing, mandated reporting requirements. Yeah, love all of these answers. So there are quite a few things we can do. Teach skills for safe social media use. Well, maybe there are legislative solutions, or maybe there aren't. When you look at what the landscape is for teens entering agreements with websites now versus in 2000, when the COPPA law was enacted, maybe 18 would have been a more appropriate age than 13. It's way too late for that. Unlikely to be successful. Even if that law were passed, teens are going to get around it. They are much better than we are. They're much better than the legislators at figuring out how to interact online the way they want to interact online. Maybe other policies that recognize impulsivity and poor decision-making in adolescents could be helpful. There have been some such policies. Not all of these are geared specifically at adolescents, and they can address some of the issues here. So the EU was ahead of the game in their GDPR law, which requires that search engines must allow users to erase certain web history. California was ahead of most of the rest of the US, having enacted in 2015 an eraser button law that requires websites to allow users under the age of 18 to remove their postings and to clearly inform them how to do so. And then more recently, the California Consumer Privacy Act in 2020 gave control over personal data collected by businesses. So you've noticed, I'm sure, that all the websites now are asking you to accept the cookies. And you've also noticed that it is much easier to click accept than to have to go through 3 or 4 or 5 layers of trying to disagree with all of the different things that they want to collect. Legislation has its limits. Again, teens will find ways to circumvent the law to interact online the way they want to interact online. And if you can erase posts, that's potentially helpful. However, if that post has already been reposted to other people, erasing your original post doesn't address that. So legislative solutions are going to be imperfect, doesn't mean they're not worth pursuing. Just another example of legislative solutions, cyberbullying laws. So most states have criminal and school sanctions that apply to cyberbullying. These aren't all cyberbullying specific laws, but cyberbullying falls under laws in most states. Parents have a role to play, monitoring teens' online activities, having some idea of what their teens are doing online, engaging their teens in discussion of posting habits and decisions. We know that consultation with adults is one of the factors that leads to mature decision-making among adolescents. And parents do face some potential legal liability for their children's online behavior. And maybe if they were aware of that, that might influence parental behavior here some. The most recent Common Sense Media survey about this showed, and this was pre-pandemic, that parents spend more than 9 hours a day themselves with screen media. And yet 78% of them think that they are good media and technology role models for their children. 40% were highly aware of what their children saw on social media. So it's not zero and it's not a majority. Schools, so there are a number of curricula on digital citizenship and safe posting. And of course, clinicians and many of the things that people mentioned. So assessment of our patients' online behaviors, discussion of the risks. We can be aware of existing or pending legislation and potentially advocate for it, while being mindful of the tendency of adolescents to find ways to get around these laws. We can participate in educational programs, be aware of how little legal oversight there is for our adolescent patients interacting online, and then help with damage control for the harms that may occur. So when you make a plan for risk assessment and intervention for your patient, you want to know which apps they're using, what they're viewing, what they're posting, what are they doing online. We know that matters for the kinds of mental health risks that may be facing. We know that matters for the kinds of legal risks they may be facing. Try to keep up with the landscape. If you're like me and don't want to use any of these sites yourself for any reason, it's still important to know what the different apps do. Instagram itself knows that Instagram is worse for some aspects of social comparison than other social media apps. You want to know that in Snapchat, the photo may disappear, but the other person can screenshot it and then send it to a bunch of people. Like having some awareness of what the particular risks are associated with the particular apps is helpful. Assess the positives. Always a good place to start. What is your teen getting out of social media participation? Assess the risks. What are they being exposed to? Is this taking the place of in-person connections? Is it having negative effects on your teen's mental health? Assess for specific risky behaviors, like many of the ones we talked about. Facilitation of potentially dangerous in-person activities, content likely to result in reputation damage, facilitation of substance abuse, cyberbullying, cyberstalking, online predation, either as victim or perpetrator, sexting. The asterisks are because if you get a disclosure, you may have a reporting obligation. So you need to think about your confidentiality disclaimer that you have before any of this comes up. And then how can we be helpful? Educate about the risks, safety planning, damage control, evaluation and treatment of related mental health symptoms, recruiting parents to be part of the conversation as well. And that is what I have to say about social media, and I welcome all of your thoughts.
You rock, Dr. Costello. Thank you so much. And I just especially enjoy the ways that you engaged all of us in participating and really thinking critically about this. Really, yes, I echo Dr. Schaller's sentiment here. Wonderful talk. Thank you, and much needed. And we need a refresher, I think. We're gonna need to revisit this post-pandemic. So anyway, I'm going to stop talking. I'd love to get folks here. Caitlin, would you mind unsharing your screen, and then we can have more Hollywood squares in here. So wow, that's lots of comments. I'm trying to find the questions. So help me here, Sam. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question.
I'll ask a question while you're looking through everything, Barbara. This is Esme. Caitlin, I'm just wondering what strategies you have, because for me, and I think for many parents, this feels like the climate crisis, where it's really easy to just like roll into the fetal position and feel like there's nothing that you can do about it because it's so messed up and it's so not constructed to protect teenagers, and the risks are so high, and it's so hard for people to take a hard line on it and just not have their teens have any access to social media. You know, I have a couple of kids in my caseload now who don't because of previous unsafe behaviors, and they still could text their friends, but their friends only group chat on Instagram. They like will not text them separately on their phone and things like that. So just like, how do you personally, or how do you recommend keeping up your resolve when the crisis seems so giant and hard to manage?
Well, that's a big question, right? I think it's fair to acknowledge that the crisis is giant and hard to manage. And trying to focus on the patient as an individual and what their specific behaviors are, what their specific risk is, what a family policy is that makes sense for them, I don't know, has been helpful for me in trying to not look at it as how am I going to solve the social media problem of the world. But no, I don't have any great answers for
fair enough. Yeah.
how to solve any of these crises.
We have a question. Oh goodness. Are there any confidential support lines for teens to call? Oh, Jessica, go ahead. Ask your question. Sorry, I didn't mean to hear you.
I was just saying that I think a lot of teens, if they really listen to you when you review confidentiality, are just not going to bring this stuff up, but they might be really suffering. And, you know, I mean, I just think as a teen, if something were like that going on, I wouldn't want to like risk legal ramifications and things like that. It's just too messy. So I was wondering if there's any hotlines that people know of where teens can call and get some support and info about these things without having the confusing component of a report.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I don't know about hotlines. If anyone does, please chime in. I think we can still be supportive without obtaining a disclosure we don't want to obtain. You know, you can talk in the abstract about online activity. You can talk in hypotheticals. I think there's lots of, you know, there are ways to talk and offer support in ways that don't result in the specific type of disclosure that is a mandated report.
Right. I'm sort of wondering if we should be doing a better job of more universal intervention, like some more education up front. That's like, even if there's a pamphlet that we give out to new teens in our program, that just educates around some of this information, how to get support, having those conversations with parents. In much the same way, if when you're talking about food insecurity, you can have access to like food banks and all that information up front. Like if we should be making a concerted effort around this stuff more universally. Sorry, I'm babbling.
I think that's a great idea. And Shelley's making a really good point in the chat that the time is before they get their first tablet or phone.
Hi, Caitlin, it's Tony. Thanks for a great talk. I had the same question that Kimberly put in the chat. And so I'm wondering, after we make if we file a CPS report for texting, what's been the follow-up? And I'm also wondering, Caitlin, is there any advice you have? Because we all want to minimize the damage to our patients. And a lot of them aren't aware of the laws, and the laws are really not fair to them, and we should be trying to protect them, but yet we're obligated reporters to CPS. And so I guess I'm wondering for your advice, is there a way to sort of minimize the risk? Like we have to contact CPS, but maybe we talk to CPS and present the case to them, and maybe we can document we spoke to CPS and they, did not feel that a full report was required, or, something so that it doesn't then then harm our patients and do more harm than good. Right.
So really, really good question. I have never made a CPS report of this nature. When this law was passed, I revised my confidentiality disclaimer. And you may need to repeat that confidentiality disclaimer, and you may need to repeat it when the conversation starts heading in that direction before an actual disclosure takes place. So I haven't really heard from other people. I don't have experience with how CPS actually tends to react to these reports. I think, what we know about legal consequences is an individual teen sexting with another individual teen is pretty unlikely to have criminal prosecution. Not never, I talked about that one case as an example. It's much more likely if they are doing something like going on to distribute without consent someone's images to a wider audience. But it's I don't have great answers to AB 1775. It's a problematic law in many ways.
Thank you, Caitlin. That was your talk. I want to just say that I really greatly appreciate it.
Oh, Emily asked about the eraser laws. So the websites are required to make it clear how to erase your posts. I don't know that they are actually all making it clear. If you find out that they're not, the Wall Street Journal might be interested.
There was some comment around feeling sad and anxious for a child who may actually be put on a sexual offender list.
Yeah, I would feel sad and anxious about that.
Yeah. Awesome. I'm just looking through the chat. This has garnered so much enthusiastic commenting. Really appreciate this talk. I hope you're seeing these, Dr. Costello. Lots of appreciation. Well, it's 1 o'clock. Holy moly. We've been through a lot today, this 1 hour. So I appreciate everyone's time and participation. Thank you again for your excellent talk. And thanks everyone for being present and participatory. So enjoy this hour that we have together. Take good care.